crowd here. I'm so pleased that all of you are with us. We've got an amazing panel. The way this is going to go, we've got kind of a shortened amount of time than we usually do for our pre-show panels because of the way this show, this production is set up. So I want to get y'all out of here at 7:05. Okay, wow. So I've got a timer. We're going to do about 20 minutes for questions that I've already sent our panel for us to discuss that. But we want to make sure that y'all have time to ask these folks questions as you see fit. So we'll have about 15 minutes afterwards to do that. Okay. So I'm going to start out by introducing our folks. We've got Doug Long. Some of you may know him. He's the minister here at the Umstead Park United Church of Christ. We've got Jennifer Copeland, who's the Executive Director of the North Carolina Council of Churches. We've got Dr. John Kolkin, who is a photographer and among many other things. So I've asked them to give us a 20-second introduction for why they're here on this panel and why this is something that interests them.
So I think this is interesting to me partly because I grew up in this area as a Southern Baptist. And my perspective growing up as a Southern Baptist is quite different than where I am now.
I grew up as a United Methodist, so it was never a problem for me. we have this wonderful thing, if there are any Methodists in the room, that we call the quadrilateral, where everything that we think about is refracted through the four pillars of Scripture, tradition, experience, and reason. And then you make up your mind.
And I come from a Jewish background and have also had the good fortune of doing international humanitarian work for 21 years around the world, with 19 of those being extended visits throughout Asia, and which has resulted in opportunities to see things from a variety of different perspectives, and have also had the honor of two private audiences with the Dalai Lama. So I come from a variety.
All right, excellent. So the first question that I wanted to start off with, when we were trying to come up with a title for this session for marketing purposes and things like that, one of the phrases that was in the original title that we came up with was, how do we reconcile science and religion? And we sent that out to the panel. And we got responses back from them that said, I don't like that phrasing, reconcile science and religion. Is there a way to do this somewhere else, to describe this in another way? Because it implies that these two things are in opposition to each other. And that was something that I think everybody on the panel felt fairly strongly about. So would y'all talk a little bit about why, and Jennifer, we were talking about this beforehand, why you felt like that was an important change for us to make?
Well, I think at first we said that to reconcile science and religion would imply that there was something that was askew, and we didn't want to set it up that way. But in all honesty, when I began to think about that in retrospect, I wanted to say this about the reconciliation of science and religion. It used to be that theology was considered the queen of the sciences. The queen of the sciences. Is that right? Am I remembering this correctly?
I read it from you.
So theology was right up there with say, chemistry and physics. And then we began to have these clashes. The Enlightenment helped some of that, but probably one of the biggest clashes, the most famous clash, was the Galileo. And I would give a bottle of wine tonight to anybody who knows the Pope that Galileo clashed with.
Pius the something.
Urban the Eighth. Somebody knew that. Oh yeah, I'm out of wine now. Galileo clashed with Urban the Eighth, and of course Galileo was kicked out of the church, and it was 350 years before he was allowed back in by John Paul II, as a matter of fact. And so to say that science and religion have clashed is certainly a true thing. But I would say in this day and age, it doesn't have to be a winner-take-all. It's not a win-lose. It's not a science or religion. Both science and religion can and should be winners. They're both winners, and we will all be the better for it when science and religion are both seen as winners. And here I'm gonna get on a little soapbox for a minute, and then I'll let John talk in a more rational way. We have got to take back our religious language from the fundamentalist heirs of William Jennings Bryan. We've got to take that language back. Those tenets of our faith have been co-opted. Things like human dignity, freedom, justice is my favorite word. Those words are now being used to create a society, and you all know this, that is only fit for people with light skin and a lot of money. And we've got to take it back. That world is being created on the spine of the Bible. And we've all forgotten that the biggest sin in the Bible really is injustice in the systems that are being perpetuated that hold people in hostage. So that would be probably the most important thing I have to say to you tonight about the reconciliation of science and religion. We have got to claim our language.
First of all, I want to make it clear that I don't speak as a representative of any other body or any other individual. So these are my own thoughts, having been exposed to quite a variety of perspectives. I think definitions are really important, so you have people speaking, at least knowing what they're having a conversation about. So when we talk about the term religion, possibly my approach to that is somewhat different, in that there's organized religions, okay, and there have been for at least 25,000 years, maybe up to 100,000 years, various religions that have come and gone over that period of time that have their own traditions, their own stories, their own metaphors, their own ceremonies. That's one kind of religion, and that, in my particular opinion, is something that tends to divide and creates the in-groups and out-groups. However, I try to look at it more in a much broader sense. In other words, the first primary question is, what is the purpose of religion? Why do we have it? And this is where I get back to what you were saying about there are some fundamental attributes that cross over no matter where you are in the world or whether you're an atheist for that matter. And that's what is it that's our guiding principle. And to me, that is the concept of religion. And the main foundation for that would be compassion. And when I say compassion, again, definition, I'm referring to an intentional, altruistic, that's called a mitzvah in the Jewish religion, altruistic action of kindness for those who are in need, whether that be Mother Earth, whether that be self, whether that be any sentient being. So if that's the primary definition of religion, and if science has an opportunity to potentially support that concept, then it's really a win-win all around. And what quantum physics seems to be showing us is that there is this universal concept of interconnectedness, not only within this planet, but also throughout the universe. So there's a concept in quantum physics called entanglement, the entanglement theory. And basically what that's saying is that if you have a planet in this part of the solar system spinning in this direction, and another one in this part of the solar system spinning in the opposite direction, when this one starts changing its course, the other one changes its course. Similarly, the concept of consciousness. There's individual consciousness, and in Eastern religions, there's the concept of reincarnation, which 25% of the world's people in various religions believe strongly in, and what even parts of Judaism, the Kabbalah, spoke about reincarnation. Reincarnation is the concept that you're just sitting in a body, but in fact what really makes you you is your consciousness. That's where your intuition and everything else comes in. And when you collectively bring all those consciousnesses together, I don't know if that's a word or not, that's where the collective consciousness occurs. And that, for some, is the concept of an almighty being. And it's actually a combination of all those together. I'm happy to go into more detail, but I don't want to take up any more time.
So my simple spin on this for me is that to take things like you just said, John, and to take them as a scientific and thoughtful perspective, I think I then weave my faith into that. I don't see any reason to deny truth as I see it, but I think that can be reconciled with our faith. So we then begin to try to define, or I try to define, what do I understand or articulate as God based on what I think is truth from another perspective. There's so many directions we can go here. I want to jump back a little bit to some of what Jennifer said, partly because I've had the opportunity to read around on this subject, and thank you, Justice Theater, for bringing it to us, because it has so many fascinating and pertinent strands in our present world. Because I'm preaching on this a couple times, so I get to talk about it there. But one of the things I've learned about William Jennings Bryan is that he was a much more nuanced character than the play makes him out. I mean, his name is not in the play. They've changed the names partly because it's fictionalized. But the way that history, I think, is remembering Bryan through the play and through the culture is a much more simple character than he actually was. He was quite progressive in many ways in his day. He was a pacifist. He was for women's suffrage. You mentioned that in an earlier conversation. He was very concerned about the way that social Darwinism was taking the culture at the time, and that the argument can be made that that was one of his primary purposes for not wanting Darwinism or evolution to be taught in the schools, because if you take Darwin's theory of natural selection and the survival of the fittest and you apply it to the human race, then you can easily make the argument, not easily, but you can make the argument that one race is more evolved than another. And it leads to imperialism, which, as a Secretary of State, William Bryan was very opposed to imperialism and war. So yes, he has given some things to our understanding of fundamentalists today, but he also was quite the progressive in his day in some ways.
Well, let me just, one more thing, and then I'll let you move on. I'm less attacking William Jennings Bryan and more the heirs of his tradition, who I think have taken religion and turned it into a blunt weapon.
I'm with you.
So, if we could take a moment, I'm struck by the fact that all of us here on the panel come from liberal religious traditions. So can we talk, and maybe Doug, you might, well, whoever feels they might be most capable of talking about this, where do we get this idea, or where does the idea come from that scientific and religious perspectives are incompatible?
I think it comes from people who assume the Bible is literally true. Okay. I don't think that that's a compatible understanding with evolution or many aspects of science. So you either have to choose between God created this on day one, or that there was something, different. And that's where William Jennings Bryan, even in the actual play, well, I don't know about the play, but in the script of the Scopes trial, you can read where he is saying, well, a day doesn't have to be a day, it could be a period, it could be an epoch, it could be anything. So, but I think that's where the conflict comes. You can't be a biblical literalist and not have a conflict with science. And I don't know.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Which is a misunderstanding of both science and the Bible, since the Bible was never meant to be a science book.
Right. Yeah, and I think this is also gets into the concept of impermanence. In other words, things are not static. Things are going to change. And if you look at a diagram of the different religions that have occurred over the last 25,000 years, you see all these intertwined and evolving ways of expression continuing. And the idea of time, it's a matter of, do we have a perspective of time between now and 10 years ago? Or do we have a perspective of time of humans have existed for 7 million years, 6 to 7 million years, okay? During that time, there's a constant evolution. Similarly, our brain's ability to function is going to be evolving over time. So back in the old days when they wrote out these stories and they were trying to explain what was going on,
Or told these stories
or
around
told these
campfires.
stories, right,
and bedtime
then
stories.
they didn't have necessarily all the science that we have now. That being said, we're not as smart as we think, and there's going to be more that we're going to learn in future generations that are going to look back at us and say, what in the world were they thinking? So it's an evolving process. Nothing is stagnant. And that's why concrete, literal interpretation of anything can be challenging. And in medicine, it's the same way. I mean, I was taught certain things in medical school, and I looked at them and I listened and said, that sounds pretty good, but you always have to keep that creative, open mind, because if you treat every patient strictly by the book, you're going to not help people. You've got to have a balance between the wisdom section and the creative section. So it's always an evolving process for all of us, regardless of where we are in our lives.
I want to talk a little bit about the secularity of American culture and how we are becoming more and more secular, partly because of scientific knowledge, partly because of lots of other reasons. Can religion survive in the scientific age? And does it offer us something different than science ever can?
Religion has been surviving in the scientific age for centuries now. So I think the question might be better phrased, can religion survive an apathetic age? It might be more of where we are now. Can our faith survive the individualism, consumerism, and capitalism that runs rampant in our societies right now?
So,
And what can science, what can science offer us to help us navigate those sorts of things? Maybe science is actually the partner for religion to get through some of that work.
Well, and I think John's already articulated that science can offer some metaphors for the mystery that I call God that deepens our understanding of how we can articulate God as well. So I think religion will survive. My concern is that not that I haven't already shown my hand, the right kind of religion survives. Because I get emails every day from people that want religion to survive in ways that I just soon see it die. I mean, there are groups that are maneuvering for the next cycle of elections that have not gotten any farther than William Jennings Bryan, or the worst of the groups that were there in 1925 at the Scopes trial in talking about evolution shouldn't be taught in public schools. In fact, there are Christian groups that are actively trying to undermine public education through our political
And curtail women's rights, and boy, that's a whole nother play. When are we writing that play?
That's a different thing.
So just to throw out a few statistics, there are 7.5 billion people in the world, approximately. And approximately 30% of them are not affiliated with any religious organization, okay? And of the other 70%, though some may attend a church or a synagogue or whatever, or say they're affiliated, as you mentioned, that doesn't mean that they're practicing compassion in their daily lives. So what we found with the museum, we had a summit with the Dalai Lama back in October, and it was 30 visionaries from the museum world from around the United States, and I was honored to co-chair that for 3.5 days. And one of the things that kept coming out was that museums needed to reinvent themselves to a certain extent to remain relevant. And the younger generation is just not going to take it for, at face value. Well, in some ways, I feel the same way about religious organizations. There has to be seen a relevance and a value in day-to-day in people's lives, particularly when there's so much stress in our society these days, which again, I could go into all kinds of statistics. So I think for religion, as organized religions to survive, they need to listen and evolve and meet the needs of a stressed out and needing population.
So we are already at that 20-minute mark, which it flew by. So can we open that up to y'all? Can we open some thoughts, some questions, some things that you might like our panelists to touch on? Does anybody have anything right away?
Don't you think that this concept of using religion as a political tool is old? Sure. I mean, it happens again and again and again in our history, and yet religions continue to evolve, sustain. It's a cycle, and it's nasty being in the middle of it, but there's an exit point. And the exit point comes because people do something about it. But I mean, you know, you go back to the Reformation. This is a fairly recent one. And go back to Christianity. That was a pretty big change.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. Let me read a couple of emails I got this week. This is from the American Renewal Project. America is doomed unless men and women conceive and orchestrate a plan, God's plan, to free Christian children from public education. There's a North Carolina Renewal Project. I've been invited along with my spouse, and you were invited along with your spouse, and everybody was invited to a free conference in Charlotte, and a personal invitation from Lieutenant Dan Forrest.
Oh, that's right, that's right. I was thinking of the other guy too.
Lieutenant Governor, yeah. Lieutenant, sorry. So, and it's there is hope for America. Her youth must be kept free from public school indoctrination.
Wow.
That's the Scopes trial of anything.
That's right.
Going?
You know, I invited Rob Schofield to go as my spouse.
Well, that's just one more example of what I was mentioning at the beginning, which is what's your definition of religion and what's its function? Okay, so if you can it's easier for me to step back and look at the big picture, and then that helps guide decision-making processes, 100 of them, 1,000 of them that you make every single day. And if your guiding principle, so His Holiness says that my religion is kindness. Full stop. And he also says that everyone that wears a robe is not a monk. So religion can be used in positive ways and negative ways. It depends on what's your guiding principle, what's your driving force. I'll give you an example in the medical world. So I was approached, I'm with this organization, Health Volunteers Overseas, and this group of neurosurgeons, and I won't say from what religious body they were, wanted to go to Mongolia to do spine surgery, and they asked the Mongolians to pick out 6 people with the most difficult spine problems. They would come on over, bring their own anesthesiologist, bring all the equipment, do the operations. And the reason they wanted to do it was to show how mighty their deity was over and above the deities of the Mongolians. Okay? So that's taking science as an example and using it not for good. Just the same way that it can happen, again, in positive and negative ways. There are an incredible number of positive things being done under the umbrella of religious organizations. No question about it. It's just what's the guiding principle.
We're having this discussion a day after the strike. I too am a Methodist, raised Methodist. I think in the age of apathy, as you mentioned, I think that we have an opportunity as a church or as progressive churches, which is that these kids are on fire. They're on fire for the climate change problem, they're on fire for gun control, they're on fire for a lot of stuff. And they don't necessarily need churches to help them do that, but to the extent churches can also be on fire for science and have creation care and things like that at their core, I think that could meld those two communities.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. The question, John, maybe you said this, is how how can, and we just want to talk about Christianity since that was the Scopes trial, how can Christianity be relevant in today's culture? Well, one way to be relevant is to get out there and march around Halifax Mall with those kids yesterday. Which, how many of us in the room were on Halifax Mall yesterday?
Good for you.
Yeah, so we can be in those places where people are fired up to make a difference about the way the world is, because the one I follow that we call Jesus the Christ wanted to make a difference in the way the world was. And you say that the Dalai Lama's driving force is compassion. I think that Christians would say that Jesus' driving force was love, but not cheap love, not sappy sentimental love, but a love that was love of compassion.
Yeah.
These things are not rocket science.
I do have one, this again, going back to terminology, I do have some problem with the term you used that you used for people not being engaged. I think actually one of the problems is that people are so stressed out and so overwhelmed. Empathy, the classic definition of empathy is feeling and sharing, absorbing the suffering of others, okay? What we found out in the medical world and in all healing professions, it's the same among clergy, it's the same among social workers, is empathy burnout. Because they're so bombarded 24 hours a day with all this negative stuff that neuroscience is clearly showing us that leads to empathy burnout, that leads to increased problems with hypertension, with diabetes, with sleep disturbances, with eating disorders. The list goes on and on and on. The challenge is understanding and recognize when your body is getting all emotionally in upheaval and learning emotion regulation and then converting that into perspective building, into seeing things for what they really are, and then with wisdom come up with a strategy to how to effectively go toward action. That's compassion. That's the definition I gave before. Compassion is an intellectual, intentional process. So it's empathy burnout. So it's not show people more horrible things. It's use compassion. It's educate the heart.
Other thoughts, questions?
I think you talking about churches evolving, and that's a big topic for wrestling with the church, because so many times we're set in our ways. The staple of churches are the elders, and a lot of elders don't want to change. So they do things. I look at Umstead. The way that Umstead's doors are open to just having. Their sanctuary is conformed. Every time I come here, it's a whole different look. There's wine on the tables outside. In some of the churches I go to, unheard of. That's not happening. It's punch and Kool-Aid.
Don't tell my mother.
And also going to the fire, and because there's a laundry list of topics to choose. So it's, especially today, there's just so much to just say we can be involved in this. I just think it's just a reluctance, and churches with people are just so set in their ways that they refuse to get out. And then what happens? The church suffers because we lose that younger group that would catch fire, and that would grow. That grows your church. So I'm not talking about the youth programs, but just the energy of the church, and just not willing to change because that's just not the way they do it.
And I think, can y'all talk, do you have another?
I was just going to ask you, since you're the pastor of the church, the caricature of Brian and how you react to that, in the sense of that he was a progressive and he had a lot of concerns that were shared with Dare politically in terms of the labor movement and women's rights and stuff like that. I just wondered if a play that caricatures him so badly.
Well, there's some
Is it-
nuance
is
to
it
the play too. There's some parts of the play where you get an inkling of all that.
Right.
And I think it's been not just the play, but the culture over time. And they see what we describe as fundamentalists today or literalists today.
Yeah.
And Brian would have used the term literalist. He wouldn't have used it the same way we did. So,
He was concerned about social Darwinism
yeah, right.
and what happened in World War I and
Yeah, absolutely.
and, the Leopold Loeb case with the murders and
Exactly.
the absence of God and the absence of morality and compassion, all those things. So,
Which are things I'm concerned about in the
Yeah, yeah, that's
same
what I-
way.
that's what I was
think,
getting at.
Yeah. So I think part of my job is to enlighten the congregation that these are not new subjects, which is one of the reasons I'm so happy that Justice Theater's done this. I mean, you can look at McCarthyism through this lens, which is what the play's
Yeah.
doing, or you can go back and look at, the 1925 here, but you can go back further and look at all these issues that are part of it as well. So.
Or you can go back to 2016.
Or you can go to right this, in October of the 3rd and 4th when people meet in Charlotte. So all this stuff is still very alive, and so I think it's my responsibility and our responsibility to be able to say, okay, now how are we stereotyping people today because they make a stand in some way? Does that mean that they're the incarnation of evil? Probably not. I mean, so
tolerance is bad no matter what point of view it comes from.
Exactly,
Basically.
exactly. So I would not say that I really try to look for the good in most people, and I'm having trouble with one. So I think that's our task, is to say, are we being fair? And how can we try that now? But to really look at. Now, there are things he said that I don't agree with at all, but I do think that there's some things he was on top of as well.
Yeah.
It should be pointed out, excuse me, that following the trial, he paid the fine. William James Brian paid a $100 fine on behalf of John Scopes.
Oh, I thought you were going to say he died.
Well, he did that too.
Yeah. I didn't realize that he paid
He
the fine. Okay.
He paid the fine.
That is interesting. I didn't know that. That is interesting.
The Scopes was found guilty and charged $100, and then later that was even overturned.
Yeah.
But I didn't realize Brian paid the
He
fine.
did.
Wasn't fundamentalism an outgrowth of a concern about science overtaking? Didn't that kind of, in the 1920s, where there was this, all of the contraptions, the inventions that everybody was enamored with, and there was a weakening, maybe a loss of authority or religion? I mean,
But that was a part of it,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, and that kind of gets back to what's the purpose of the religion, and if it's to be in control and be an authoritative and, ego and power or whatnot, that's not a good reason.
yeah.
There are much better reasons to have religion.
Yeah, I'm just gonna say that the evangelicals, you don't wanna paint them with too broad a brush, because many evangelicals now are also becoming quite interested in the environment and environmental movement. Because, the term evangelical can be misused as applying only to to most fundamental.
William Barber calls himself an evangelical.
Yeah.
There's a case in point. Yeah.
And I think, if we were teaching a class on American Christianity, then we would clearly make a distinction between fundamentalism and evangelicalism. There are some fundamentalists who are evangelicals, but fundamentalism is its own kind of thing that, like you said, grew out of the 20s and the 30s and kind of went underground after the Scopes trial for a little while, but reared its head again pretty mightily in the 60s. And remember what was going on in the 60s. And that's probably where you got a lot of that Southern Baptist teaching that you were talking about earlier.
I was a lot in the 60s.
Yeah.
I'll inject just one final thing, because I know we're running out of time, and that's the psychology of how do you motivate people toward doing good and using positive motivation rather than in Buddhism, it's in order to have good karma for your next life, because they believe in reincarnation, you need to do good things now and build up your, you know, in some Western traditions, it's you're going to go to hell. Rather than the concept of true altruism. In other words, I don't know for sure whether there's a heaven or a hell or whether there's reincarnation or whatnot. I mean, I'm hoping that I'll just do good because it's the right thing to do, and if I'm just doing good because it's the right thing to do, you know, I'm in, you know? You know? And if there's not, I've still done the right thing. So what's the motivating factor? So if it's a positive mindset of why I'm doing what I'm doing without expecting to get something in return, that's a healthy form of motivation.
That's your Jewish roots coming out.
On that lovely note, oh, I'm so sorry. I have to cut everybody off. I have to. I'm sorry. Folks, thank y'all so much for coming. Thank you so much to our panelists. Please enjoy the show. Come back and see the rest of the season that we have at Justice Theater Project.